On the night of 7th October 2006, nothing about the car park in Shefford felt dangerous. It was the kind of small Bedfordshire town where Saturday evenings blurred into routine. Fluorescent lights hummed above painted white lines. A supermarket trolley rolled loose in the wind. Teenagers lingered because there was nowhere else to be. And somewhere in that ordinary space, a crime unfolded that would take nearly 20 years to answer. For the girl at the centre of it, the night never really ended. She was young. Not a headline, not a statistic, just a teenager meeting friends in a car park, the way teenagers across Britain have done for decades. There was chatter, laughter, a plan to grab something from the shop. A boy she knew loosely, Kenny, he'd told her, was around. Not a stranger, not quite a friend, familiar enough to lower her guard. When her friend stepped inside the supermarket, the atmosphere shifted. It didn't shift loudly. There was no dramatic music, no obvious warning. Just a subtle change in tone, a suggestion to move, a step closer, a hand that didn't feel casual anymore. What happened next would be described in court years later in clinical language. But in that moment it was confusion, fear, shock. She was pulled into the back of a car. The space was tight. The doors were shut. The world outside continued. Cars arriving, people walking in and out of the shop, while inside her control vanished. The assault was quick, violent and devastating. When her friend returned and realised something was wrong, panic took over. She ran to a nearby pub, burst through the door, and told the first adult she saw that something terrible had happened. Police were called. Blue lights cut through the quiet town. Officers arrived within minutes. They took statements, secured the scene, collected forensic evidence. They treated it seriously, because it was serious. A teenage girl had reported rape in a public car park, but investigations live or die on identification, and Kenny was not enough. In 2006, forensic science was powerful, but limited compared to what it would become. Detectives worked the case hard. They canvassed the area, checked CCTV, spoke to local young men who might fit the vague description. The victim could describe him physically, could describe his voice, the car, fragments of detail, but no full name, no clear address. The forensic samples were processed and stored, and then the case stalled. There are thousands of cases like this in Britain's archives, files boxed, labelled, waiting, not forgotten, but paused. Investigators move on, teams change, victims grow older, life continues, unevenly. For the girl who reported that crime, there was no pause. Trauma does not archive neatly. Years passed, she became an adult, built a life around something that had fractured her sense of safety. Every birthday marked not just age, but distance from that night, and still no arrest. Meanwhile, somewhere else in England, Kennedy Jimmy was living his life. He was in his 20s when the crime occurred. Over the next 2 decades, he moved through adulthood, largely unnoticed by the justice system in connection to that offence. There was no public suspicion attached to his name. No arrest for this crime, no charge. The file sat cold, until it didn't. In the early 2000s, police forces across the UK began reviewing historic sexual offences using advances in forensic technology. DNA analysis had evolved dramatically since 2006. Profiles could now be extracted from smaller, more degraded samples. Databases had expanded. In Bedfordshire, a major review operation began examining unsolved serious sexual offences. Cold cases aren't reopened casually. It takes resources, time and belief that something new might be found. But this one had preserved forensic material, and that mattered. The sample from 2006 was retested. This time the technology was sharper, more sensitive, the profile clearer, and when it was run against the national database, a name appeared: Kennedy Jimmy. He was by then in his 40s, living in Stoke-on-Trent. The match wasn't vague, it wasn't speculative, it was scientific. The DNA linked him to the crime scene. Nearly 20 years after that supermarket car park assault, the file came back to life. In November 2022, officers arrested Kennedy Jimmy. For the victim, that moment carried weight few people understand. A knock on the door, a call from detectives, the words, "We've identified him." Relief doesn't come cleanly in cases like this. It arrives tangled with anxiety. Court means retelling, It means cross-examination. It means reopening wounds carefully scarred over. But it also means recognition. Jimmy was charged. The Crown Prosecution Service moved forward. The case was prepared for trial at Luton Crown Court. And in late 2025, nearly 19 years after the crime, a jury would hear what happened. Trials are not cinematic in the way television portrays them. They are slower, more procedural, evidence is presented in fragments, lawyers speak in measured tones. The prosecution laid out the timeline, the meeting in Shefford, the friend going into the shop, the sudden assault in the car. They presented forensic findings, they explained the DNA match, the defense challenged memory, challenged time, challenged reliability. That is how trials work. The victim gave evidence. For survivors of sexual violence, court can feel like a second ordeal. Every detail examined, every pause scrutinised. But she stood by her account, and the DNA evidence stood with her. After a 5-day trial, the jury found Kennedy Jimmy guilty of rape. There was no dramatic outburst, no sudden twist, just a verdict. Guilty. In February 2026, Kennedy Jimmy was sentenced. 6 years imprisonment, a lifelong restraining order preventing contact with the victim. For some observers, 6 years might seem short for a crime that altered a life permanently. Sentencing guidelines in historic cases are complex. Courts must apply the framework that existed at the time of the offence. The judge acknowledged the seriousness. The delay was not the victim's fault, but the conviction mattered. Because this was not just about one sentence. It was about proof that time does not erase accountability. The story of Kennedy Jimmy is not about notoriety. He was not a gang leader, not a serial offender splashed across tabloids for years. He was something more unsettling, ordinary. That ordinariness is what makes cases like this powerful in documentary form. There was no criminal empire, no dramatic chase, just a young girl assaulted in a car while everyday life continued around her, and a man who assumed he had escaped. The science changed that assumption. DNA technology has reshaped modern justice. What once required large biological samples can now be established from traces invisible to the naked eye. Cold cases once considered impossible have reopened. Offenders who believed themselves safe for decades have been identified by a single stored profile. In this case, the evidence never disappeared. It waited. For the victim, the conviction closed a legal chapter, not a personal one. Survivors often describe justice as complicated. It doesn't rewind time. It doesn't erase memory. But it validates truth. For nearly 2 decades, she carried a story that had no official conclusion. Some survivors question themselves over time. Memory shifts, details blur, doubt creeps in. Not about what happened, but about whether it will ever matter in a courtroom. This time, it did. Police described the case publicly as proof that time is no barrier to justice. It is a phrase often used, sometimes too easily, but in cases where evidence is preserved and technology evolves, it becomes tangible. Cold cases rely on 3 things: preservation, patience, and progress. This one had all 3. There is another layer to this story that documentaries often explore: how offenders live in the gap between crime and consequence. For nearly 20 years, Kennedy Jimmy was not publicly linked to this assault. He worked, lived, aged, perhaps believing the risk had passed. But forensic databases expand. Arrests for unrelated matters can lead to DNA being taken and uploaded. Old samples can be reanalyzed with new methods. Time, once seen as a shield, becomes a trap. And when the match appears on a screen in a forensic lab, the past catches up instantly. The supermarket car park in Shefford still exists. Cars still pull in and out. Teenagers still meet friends. The fluorescent lights still hum. Most people walking across that tarmac have no idea what happened there in 2006. That is the strange nature of crime scenes outside major cities. They return to normal. The world does not mark them permanently, but for one woman, that location carries a different weight. For her, the night did not blur into routine. It split her timeline in 2, before and after. True crime documentaries often focus on the perpetrator, what drove them, what patterns existed, what warning signs were missed. In this case, there was no known pattern presented in court beyond that single charge. The conviction rested on the assault in Shefford and the DNA that linked him to it. Sometimes there is no grand psychological profile, sometimes there is simply a choice made in a moment, a decision to exploit vulnerability, a decision to use force, and then years of silence. The justice system is imperfect, cases fall through gaps, evidence degrades, witnesses move away, resources are stretched, but when technology bridges those gaps, the impact can be profound. Operation reviews of historic sexual offences have led to numerous convictions across the UK in recent years. When sentencing was handed down, the courtroom would have felt different from that car park 19 years earlier. No fluorescent flicker, no open doors, no uncertainty about what happened. Instead, there was structure, legal language, a formal acknowledgement of guilt. For the victim, it was a moment nearly 2 decades in the making. For Kennedy Jimmy, it was the moment the past arrived. If there is a lesson in this story, it is not about fear, it is about preservation. The evidence collected in 2006 was handled properly, stored, maintained. That diligence mattered. Without it, there would have been no DNA match, no arrest, no trial. Cold cases are often solved not by luck, but by procedure. A swab sealed correctly, a sample logged accurately, a file not discarded. Justice sometimes depends on quiet competence. Today, Kennedy Jimmy is serving his sentence. The victim carries something more complex than closure, but she carries a verdict too. And in a small town car park where life continues as normal, a story once frozen in time has finally been answered. Not erased, not undone, but acknowledged. Nearly 20 years later, the silence broke, and the name Kenny became Kennedy Jimmy, convicted rapist, identified by science, held accountable by a system that refused to let the evidence disappear. In true crime, the loudest stories are often the ones filled with spectacle. This one is different. It is about patience, it is about the slow turning of forensic progress, and it is about a young girl who spoke up in 2006 and was finally heard in 2026.